In the face of congressional inaction around immigration, the greatest chance for immigration reform at the moment rests with the executive branch. So on this screen, you can see a brief rundown of what Biden has done so far. Most policies have not had quite the impact that you might expect, or that as immigrant advocates that we might want to see. And there are many reasons for this, but one of them really is Biden ran as a moderate, and in many ways he's governing as a moderate. So for example, despite ending the migrant protection protocols policy, also known as Remain in Mexico, the border remains effectively sealed under a Trump-era pandemic policy known as Title 42. So these are the two policies that I'm going to be discussing in the presentation today, Title 42 and MPP, or also known as Remain in Mexico. So a quick reminder of what MPP was. At this point, I think everybody's pretty much familiar with the policy, but in case you're not, on December 20th, 2018, Department of Homeland Security announced that it would begin forcing thousands of asylum seekers to wait for their US immigration proceedings to unfold in Mexico. So when all was said and done, at least 70,000 people have been returned to Mexico under the program, and about 25,000 people still remain in the program, waiting for an opportunity to be processed into the United States. On Biden's first day in office, he announced that DHS would no longer be placing asylum seekers into the program, and in February, DHS announced that they would begin to process people who were still in the MPP program into the United States. Bureaucratic challenges have gotten the process off to a little bit of a slow start. According to partners in Mexico, for example, at the port in Tijuana, they're only processing about 50 people a day. So it's really a drop in the bucket. But just the fact that the process has begun, it's a welcome and a significant first step. So ending MPP was part of Biden's more humane approach to the border. However, the administration clearly has remained concerned about the potential for border surges, which is why it has continued to expel most migrants arriving at the border under Title 42. So like I said before, this is a Trump-era policy, and it allows border agents to immediately turn back migrants crossing the border without arresting them. It also prevents people from even asking for asylum. So whereas under MPP, people could ask for asylum, but then they would have to wait out their immigration proceedings in Mexico, under Title 42, people are not even able to request asylum at the border. Since it was announced in March 2020, more than 514,000 migrants have been expelled, including more than 13,000 children. An exception for unaccompanied minors has been in place since November 2020. And in addition to this, Mexico recently changed its laws preventing the detention of children, which has obligated the United States to start accepting some families with young children. So at this point, I wanted to invite Tracey from KBI to introduce this short video clip that I'm going to show about someone who was affected by Title 42, and if she could just kind of give us a little context for the video and put it in place as to what she's seeing on the ground.
Thank you so much, Kayla Marie. My name is Sister Tracey Horan. I'm a Sister of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana, and I'm also the Associate Director of Education and Advocacy with the Keno Border Initiative. I know many of you are probably familiar with our work. We work on the US and Mexico sites here in Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora on humanitarian aid, education, and advocacy for just immigration reform. And so, we've been really seeing the impacts of Title 42 and of the slow movement that Caitlin mentioned under MPP on a personal level with the folks that come to our Migrant Aid Center every day. The clip that you're going to see is from a man named Fernando from Guatemala, who he was returned. He tried to cross through the desert
to enter the US and was returned to Mexico a couple of days after he was detained by Border Patrol. And so he fell victim to this Title 42 policy. And his story is just one of hundreds of thousands of people who have been put into the system, tossed back into Mexico. We've seen lots of people being returned late at night. Up to 100 people just dropped in Nogales, Sonora at 2 a.m., for example. And so we've seen a lot of dangers, an uptick in the amount of abuses that people are suffering at the hands of Border Patrol. In this process where there's no paperwork, it's really tough to hold agents accountable when migrants aren't really going through due process. So it's something that we've been really concerned about. Title 42 and this border closure, which we know public health experts have said, it actually has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's really been used as an excuse to hold back asylum seekers. And so, some of the things that Caitlin Marie mentioned, we're seeing on a daily basis. I just talked yesterday to a couple of people who had asked for asylum directly to a Border Patrol agent as they were being processed and were still returned to Mexico. We've even seen people who have experienced kidnapping or assault in Mexico who were then returned. And so, obviously that's very concerning because it's putting people right back in line of the danger that they were fleeing to begin with. And I particularly wanted to share this story because I think in the news, a lot of you, I know you're all very aware and following what's going on. We see a lot about the women and children who are traveling. And obviously that's a big concern for us as well. We want humane conditions and those folks can be particularly vulnerable. But I wanted to share our single men who are traveling. And what I noticed is that those folks too, their stories are about family. So, to kind of challenge that narrative, that really single men as well, are traveling because they have a sick family member that they can't provide for, or because their house and all of their belongings were just destroyed in the hurricanes in the fall. I talked to a gentleman yesterday who they still haven't gotten electricity back after the hurricanes, and this is months later. And he said there's just really no option to put food on the table. And so just to kind of bring in that perspective as well, obviously, people migrate for lots of different reasons. And as Catholics, we believe in the right to migrate. And so recognizing that whether people are traveling as single adults or as family units, that a lot of times family is still the driving force for them. So, you'll hear Fernando talk about his experience in the desert and just all of the complications. And I would just challenge you to kind of consider, and I think our director, Joanna Williams, said it best, that, what we're seeing is, ordinary people who are making the best decision that they can in extraordinary circumstances. So kind of, putting ourselves in that position, recognizing the complicated nature of the decisions that families are facing when they make the decision to migrate.
Por pobreza, tanto política como económicamente, me obligaron a salir de mi país. Encontré supuestamente una solución en manos de personas que hacen la trata. Para esas personas, uno simple y sencillamente no es nada, no es nadie. Uno no significa nadie para ellos. Si uno llega, para ellos está bien. Si uno no llega, igual. Sigo temiendo por mi vida. Tenía miedo de no ver a mis hijos, nada más a mi esposa. No sé, no sé. Porque si regreso a mi país es muy duro porque dejé hipotecado lo poco que tenía y no considero pagarlo allá. Entonces no sé qué hacer.
Thanks, Tracy, for sharing that story with us. And yeah, I think it is really important to keep that perspective in mind. That a lot of the headlines that we're seeing are about families and young children, but um, uh, single adults are also an important presence, and also factor into issues of families and of families' need to migrate. And it's an important perspective to keep in mind. So we've seen a number of sensationalist headlines describing what's happening at the border, the crisis, the surge at the border. But headlines often don't reveal the full extent of what's actually going on. While it's true that the overall numbers are very high and they're higher than they've been in a decade, it's important that we keep these numbers or view these numbers in context. First of all, the number of encounters at the southwest border have been steadily rising since last spring. I use the word encounters because people are versus arrests, since people are just being quickly processed and then expelled back into Mexico. But so the numbers have been rising since last spring. So this is not something that has just emerged through under Biden or because of something Biden has said or done. The last time that we saw numbers that were comparable to what we're seeing today was in the summer of 2019. Then the surge was driven primarily by the arrivals of unaccompanied minors and family units from Central America. Now, as you can see from this graph, that's kind of flipped. And the surge is driven primarily today by single adults. About 71% of encounters over the course of this year have been amongst single adults. And the last thing I'd say to keep in mind is that the overwhelming majority of those who are arriving at the border are still being expelled under Title 42. So why is this happening? A couple of different reasons. One, sort of ironically, there's a perverse incentive that's created by Title 42. People are caught crossing today are fingerprinted, processed, and dropped off. They're not prosecuted or disqualified from other forms of relief, such as asylum, as they might have been prior to the pandemic. This has contributed to an increased recidivism rate. That is, people who try to cross, get caught, and then try again. CBP estimates that the recidivism rate is about 40%. If we compare that to fiscal year 2019, it doesn't make sense to compare it to 2020 because of the pandemic, everything got thrown. So comparing it to the rate of fiscal year 2019, the recidivism rate was only 7%. Another factor is worsening conditions, both the economic impact of COVID-19 and back-to-back hurricanes in Central America. Trump policies have created a buildup at the border. Title 42 has been in place since March 2020. So people previously expelled at the border are still waiting there and trying to get in and still needing to migrate. And the last thing I'd say is that this is really a failure on the part of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and possibly continuing into the Biden administration. You know, we've seen this shift in demographics and an increase in child migrants and families since 2014. And so there's really not an excuse for our government to be caught so flat-footed again. So how is Biden responding? I would say it's a mixed bag of both good and bad policies. In terms of the bad policies, he's launched a public relations campaign in South and Central America to tell people that the border is closed. This is a strategy that's been proved to be ineffective, and it's really not in keeping with the more humane image that he is trying to cultivate with regards to immigration policy. Another negative thing would be this week he announced that he'd signed agreements with Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala to increase enforcement against migrants. Again, this does not stop migration. It just forces other countries to do the US's dirty work. Furthermore, regional cooperation really should not be excluded to containment, especially when it affects those who are in need of international protection. The third negative response has been he has opened or is in the process of opening several temporary facilities to house unaccompanied minors. These are many of which are unlicensed and have little oversight, and that can cause a number of worrying conditions. On the flip side, there have been some good policies. He formally ended the 2018 information sharing agreement between DHS and the Department of Health and Human Services over sponsors' immigration status. Health and Human Services is the agency that's responsible for caring for unaccompanied minors and connecting them with their sponsors in the United States. This agreement had previously led to the arrest of over 100 sponsors, most without any criminal record, in the span of 5 months in 2018. And that, of course, had a significant cooling effect on the willingness of other sponsors to come forward and identify themselves. He is currently in the process of creating joint processing centers at the border so that children can be placed in HHS care immediately after CBP encounters them. And he's also restarted the Central American Minors Program. This is a program that allowed children with a parent already lawfully in the US to be screened for refugee status or parole from their home countries or a neighboring country. This was a policy that was started under the Obama administration, but it was quickly ended under the Trump administration. And in ending it, he left 3,000 children stranded who had already been approved for travel. So just as a conclusion, the sensational headlines that we're seeing, I think that they exaggerate the extent of the crisis, and they really fail to provide us with any kind of context. However, we can't just dismiss them because they have an impact on public policy, and that then has a ripple effect on Biden's ability to see through some of his other immigration priorities. The U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, or the DREAM Act, or any of these other policy proposals that are on the table to try to provide a pathway to citizenship for some or all of the undocumented population in the United States. What's happening at the border, it can be used as an excuse to not do anything, or it can make people who might otherwise be sympathetic to supporting these policies too afraid of the political consequences for supporting a pathway to citizenship when there's the impression that the border is out of control. So as you can see in the presentation, Biden has the ability to do something. He has the capacity to act to a certain extent, but that power is often limited, and it's frequently subject to legal battles. His 100-day moratorium on deportation is an example of that. So long-term solutions really depend on congressional action. Setting immigration policy is a congressional responsibility, and I think that as advocates, we need to keep reminding lawmakers of that fact. The border is always going to be with us. It will continue to challenge us, and we can't let that be an excuse for lawmakers to do nothing. And furthermore, people are suffering as a result of these flawed border policies, and it's just not acceptable, particularly as people of faith, that that suffering is leveraged as a policy or as a political strategy. So immigration advocacy needs to take a two-pronged approach moving forward. We've got to continue on an executive level, since they're in the best position to be acting immediately. But at the same time, we need to continue to push Congress to enact some long-term and much needed long-term solutions.